Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning.
Well, we sit here with less than 3 weeks to go at the end of this legislative session. Fresh poll out last week. Lots going on. We met with Darren Shaw last week for the podcast, talked about some aspects of the poll. As is often the case with Darren, we leveraged his interest in and expertise in national politics and particularly 2024. We want to return to the poll results as a point of departure again this week, but I think it makes sense for us to focus on two issues that are very much in the news in Texas in the last few days. Neither of which are especially pegged to good news. And these are issues that are likely to continue to be front and center in the next few weeks. One is gun safety and gun safety legislation, and interesting turn that's taken in the last few days in the Texas Legislature, which we'll talk about. And the perennial issue of the border as we look at the ending of the Title 42 program coinciding, seems to me, with the expected seasonal surge in migrant traffic at the border. So we have polling data on both of those. So let's just jump in. We'll start with guns. It's been another terrible couple of weeks of gun violence in Texas. I don't know how many times we've started the podcast with that particular phrase, but such as it is. A little over a week ago, a man in Cleveland, Texas, shot and killed a family of five that precipitated a several-day manhunt. Suspect is now in custody, but that generated tons of national news and attention in the state. And, we might circle back to that, also wound up intersecting, at least briefly, with the issue of immigration.
Right.
And then this past weekend, of course, 9 people were killed, several others injured in a mass shooting at an Allen, Texas mall. That was over this past weekend. We're recording on Tuesday morning. Now, that was all punctuated yesterday with a, I think it's fair to say, somewhat unexpected turn of events in the House Select Committee on Community Safety, which moved Representative King's HB 2744 out of committee on an 8-5 vote, and that's the bill written, I think, in close cooperation with the survivors of the Uvalde massacre and in mind. And this is a bill that would raise the age to purchase or own certain kinds of semi-automatic style weapons from 18 to 21. And that is a bill, before we get into it, that I would add is pretty carefully and narrowly crafted.
Extremely.
Representative King, I think, took a lot of input and is a pretty accomplished legislator, and wrote that bill with important carve-outs for veterans, for example, and with a pretty narrow scope on what kind of weapons you would be limiting access to, or raising the age of legal access to. Now, in the interim between us, this shooting happened in the interim between us releasing the poll or collecting the data and releasing the poll and this discussion now. And in the interim, one of the things that got the most attention in last week's poll were a couple of items that we had on raising the age of legal access and red flag laws, right?
Yeah, I think I should flag, because you just sort of made a point implicitly. I'll make it explicitly, too, that we collected this data before this most sort of recent spate of shootings. I think the Cleveland mass shooting had occurred while we were in the field.
Yeah.
But we'll kind of talk about this. We wouldn't necessarily suspect that to influence the results that much, to be quite honest. But the mass shooting in Allen, Texas definitely happened after we were in the field. So what we found, we didn't pull a ton of gun control measures because honestly, they're not really on the agenda for the most part. I mean, that's sort of what
We
you're
certainly
saying.
didn't seem that way when we were writing questions.
No, and the reason that we asked them was simply, in a lot of ways for sort of two kind of combined reasons. One, it's still the first session after the Uvalde mass shooting, and this was one of the, certainly raising the age to purchase a firearm was one of the main proposals that came out in response to that tragedy, but also in addition to, I think, measuring responses to a bunch of sort of the legislative agenda as laid out by the GOP majority, we also wanted to touch it base on a few of the major issues that Democrats have been pushing this session, even if we don't expect them to move very much. Right.
And broadly speaking, well, not even broadly speaking, and gun safety, gun violence, if you combine that also with school safety, an issue really triggered by gun, really are, issues that are very salient to Democrats.
Exactly. So what did we find? So first and foremost, we found 3/4 of voters support raising the age to legally purchase any firearm. So not even these sort of specific carve-outs that we're
That's
talking
how we
about
phrased
in
the
King
question
bill,
as
right.
kind of a catch-all.
Right. Any firearm from 18 to 21 years of age. So again, 76% of Texas voters, 91% of Democrats, but also 64% of Republicans. So about 2/3 of Republicans, 82% of independents. Another item we asked about was sort of the concept of a red flag law, which we talk about in terms of allowing courts to require a person who's determined to be a risk to themselves or others to temporarily surrender guns in their possession. This was supported by a similar large share of Texas voters, 72%, 88% of Democrats, 64% of Republicans, and 57% of independents. And so that was sort of the big kind of, check in. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting because these results, ended up receiving a lot of attention in the press. Having said that, they're not really new results for us. These aren't even really big shifts in terms of the numbers. In fact, they're not really shifts in terms of the share of voters who support these kinds of proposals as we've tested over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting. I've gone. We've both done this, and we've gone back and we've looked at the trend here, and it is interesting. I mean, how you judge the movement among Republicans, because on one hand, I'm pretty sure that every time we've looked and we've written about this, it's not as if every time there's a shooting we see a definite corresponding shift in favor of more gun control, to use the old school term, or gun safety measures, et cetera. That said, in going back, I was talking to a reporter over the weekend and went back and looked at, the item on gun safety that will, or not gun safety, the item on whether more guns make, people think more guns make people more or less safe, right? Or make the country more or less safe, and there is a, how should I put this? A noticeable, if not determinative shift in Republican attitudes.
Yeah. I mean, we've written about this before, and there's some, I like to, pat ourselves on the back, whatever. But there's some good stuff on the Texas Politics Project website that really kind of goes through gun attitudes and lays out the case for why a particular mass shooting doesn't necessarily, lead to big shifts in public opinion. And the result you're pointing to, I think, is one of the key results that we found over time, which is that, underlying, I think, widespread acceptance for nibbling around the edges of legal gun ownership. And again, you're not talking about taking away legal gun ownership in most cases. You're talking about adding in some additional hurdles, some safeties, some checks. And just like, it's a weird, I just can't help but compare to this. If you think about years, if not decades, of the right nibbling around abortion exceptions, saying, well, we can just can't we have a 2-day waiting period? Can't we just and the truth is, if you look at public opinion data, generally you do find, around these sort of, what politicians colloquially call, common sense legislation, or surely
common sense X. Yes.
Yeah, surely we should all agree X. And you'd see that around abortion. You'd see it in the data. You wouldn't see a huge amount of Democratic opposition to, say, an extra day waiting period or to notifying parents or things like that. And I think the same thing is true with Republicans with respect to a lot of these gun laws. Just like in abortion, there's sort of a core underlying orientation towards the role that guns play in society that creates, I think, a huge amount of this tension, especially for leadership when it comes to sort of figuring out both politically what's palatable, right, in terms of moving gun laws forward, but also what they're willing to even defend. And that comes to this item that you raise here about, essentially, do Texans think more guns mean more, put simply, means more safety, essentially, the sort of, if they're good guys with guns, that'll deter bad guys, that'll stop bad guys, etc. Or does it just mean there's a bunch more guns around and there's more of these kinds of shootings?
Yeah, it's kind of evaluate an almost marketized approach to guns.
Right. And Democrats overwhelmingly, usually 3/4 or more will say, yeah, that just leads to less safety, right? There's more guns, less safe. Republicans, you tend to find about in the neighborhood of 2/3, but to your point, going down a little bit over time would say, no, more guns leads to more safety. And so that's why I think, in the wake of these things, you find this sort of, on the one hand, calls for, clamping down on guns, especially on the left. And on the right, when talking especially about things like, so these sorts of things, you think about, well, if more, we need more good guys with guns, or in the case of schools, maybe we need to arm teachers. Maybe we need to arm, retired police officers on the school campuses. And this is fully in line with, I think, where the attitudes are, but it also leads a lot of people to say, well, wait a minute, though. But how do Republicans also say they want to, again?
And that has been an active discussion at the legislature.
Yeah, and that's been a very
where you've intersected, basically school shootings, gun policy.
Right, and I think that's sort of, and I think Senator Cruz almost kind of walked into this in some ways a few weeks ago because he posted this meme to, I don't know what to call it really, but something somewhere on some social media. I don't know what you'd call it at this point, but a card, whatever you want to call it, basically saying, hey, banks have armed guards. Why don't schools? And there was a big mass murder at a bank, which a lot of people sort of pointed out as sort of I don't even know what you'd say, a gotcha, or whatever. But ultimately, these things are all pretty consistent, but it does point to why you see a lot more sort of discussion about well, should we arm more teachers than should we take guns away from more people, right?
Right.
But to the broader point here, I think what you're starting to see is the impact of accumulation.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was thinking about we've been looking for,
and I think we've polled much.
This is not a punctuated equilibrium case.
No,
right?
and we've polled before mass shootings and right after mass shootings, and sort of shown the consistency of these attitudes. And you don't necessarily see big shifts within even a tragedy as horrible as Uvalde. But when you look at this over the course of 3 years, 5 years, even 7 to 10 years, like we have been doing, you are seeing a softening of sort of an absolutist position on this. And the absolutist position in this case isn't that no, there can't be any restrictions on guns, because that's ridiculous. We see in the data that nobody believes, almost nobody believes that. But what we're seeing is a softening in the position that guns don't have anything to do with this problem. Right.
And, the collision between the general attitude and the specific incremental adjustment is really just striking here, and I think makes it very tricky to interpret. Because I think you can see this glass is half, classic kind of half full, half empty. In some ways, literally half. The last time we asked about whether gun laws in Texas should be more or less strict, after all of the legislation that we've seen in recent years,
really after the 2021 session, and the lessening of the restrictions required to carry a handgun in most public places. Right,
but even before that, that did build incrementally. We saw campus carry before that. We saw, relaxation in concealed carry laws, et cetera. Even after all that. So after all that, basically, in February 2023, half of Republicans said that gun laws should be left the way they are now.
Yep. Right.
Now, that is adjacent to, and probably not in that poll, because I don't think we asked in this poll. I'd have to go back and check. But that is coming at roughly the same time as we're seeing, the guns say, the guns make people, more guns makes people more safe, right? In a little higher than that, but in that range, high 50s in that same time period. But also 3/4 or 2/3 roughly, I guess, where we are with Democrats, a little less than that, I suppose, 57%. Still in favor of these incremental proposals that we're talking about.
Yeah, and the thing is, on that strictest measure, the reality is, to the extent we've seen movement on that's anything other than incremental, it's usually been after a session in which the legislature has significantly loosened gun access, and it's usually been a lot of movement among Republicans.
Right.
And so what we find is that, over the years, as the legislature has sort of taken steps to ease gun access, you see, one, I would say marginal support among Republicans in most cases for most of those over the years. I think back over the polling, but then after the poll, you see this, it's called this thermostatic response, where the public says, oh, okay, you did it. Good. Let's just adjust back now, or let's stay where we are. This is good.
Right. This is good. I'm comfy.
But, now I think a lot of voters are having, even I think, those with relatively favorable views towards gun ownership are needing to kind of come to terms with the fact that you can't turn on the news within a given week without seeing something. And the thing, seeing some sort of terrible tragedy. And the reality is, as we enter the summer, it's not like these incidents are likely to, I would say recede or decrease in frequency. I mean, I think, Representative Wu yesterday, Gene Wu of Houston, during the Democratic press conference earlier in the day on gun violence, kind of in the lead up to, I think, some of the precursor to the movement that led to that vote to advance the bill that would raise the age to own certain semi-automatic firearms, brought up, said something I think that really kind of crystallized, I think it's a question, and I'm putting a pin in this, right? But it's an interesting question. He says, Americans don't feel safe anymore, right? They don't feel safe in their churches. They don't feel safe in their schools. They don't feel safe, shopping. I mean, we're working on a piece right now, and there's a line in it to quote ourselves, which is really just, whoo.
Yeah.
Is this thing on? No. Anyway, but it says, there's an assumption here, right? I think in America, reasonably in a lot of places, that when you send your kids to public schools, that the teachers and the students are going to be safe. And I think to the extent that that can't be taken as a de facto truth at this point in time, I think that's a real shaking of the foundation of some of these ideas.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think and yet
yeah, and yet
there are a lot of cross currents for this. So let's to bring this to bear on where we are at the moment. So Tracy King's bill got voted out of committee yesterday with 2 Republican votes.
At pains.
Very surprising. I'm sorry?
At great pains.
At great pains to, as we've seen on social media, to sort of explain those votes. Nonetheless, the bill has now moved more than people had expected. I'm pretty sure nobody expected that they were even going to get a vote, let alone that if they got the vote, they would get some Republican votes and the bill would move. Now, this is where the reality of where we are in the legislative process really, kind of sets in and has to be mentioned.
Right.
That bill now has to be heard by the Calendars Committee, which is meeting fairly frequently now because of where we are in the session, to be scheduled for debate. It has to be put on a House calendar. That's going to have to happen by Thursday. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's going to be it actually has to happen before Thursday because Thursday is the last day in which the House can hear House bills for the second reading.
Professor Henson, I have a question.
Okay, hopefully I have an answer.
So if it does get scheduled by the Calendars Committee for a hearing in the full House, does that mean that it'll be heard by the full House?
I think probably, but it will still be vulnerable to procedural challenge.
And it can be procedural challenge to directly or even just a casualty of other challenges.
Yeah, I mean, look, once we get down, say it's on the calendar for Thursday, that midnight deadline is pretty hard.
Right.
Right. And so, the chances of this bill getting out of the House are still
exceedingly slim.
Pretty small.
Yeah.
Right. And remember that there will be, this gets us into, some things that I've, for the insiders, you've probably heard some of this or maybe noticed this, that, there's a lot of discussion in the community right now, in the Capitol community, among the professionals and the engaged and stakeholders about how the rules are being enforced in the House. Mm-hmm. Without going too much into history, it does seem like, and we need to look this up, and hopefully somebody on Twitter will do this for us, or we'll figure out a way to make the time to do this. But it does seem like the readings of the rules have been pretty tight, particularly in a couple of areas, and we've seen a lot of bills pulled down or go down on points of order directly, right? And so, I think what this does is really opens up the possibility that this bill could move by a leadership that is probably ambivalent at best about its chances, or could be reading this a lot of different ways, but then be vulnerable to a point of order like many other big bills have been this session. We've seen it, the bill on supportive care for trans kids has been pulled from the floor twice under threats of points of order. Right. And so I find it very likely that as this bill moves, should this bill make it onto a calendar in the House, a lot of energy will be going into scrutinizing every single word related to this bill, every move that it's made in order to find points of order to get it pulled off the calendar on the floor.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this is really setting up perfect for something scheduled late in the process that at least turns the screws on some Democrats who might want to chub, who might want to slow down the process in the final stretch. You put this near the end of the counter. It's like, hey, if you want to, hey, Democrats killed this. I mean,
I
there's
think
a lot of ways you can play this.
I mean, I think that's a good point, that the general, mood that we expect as we go into the, really starting this minute.
Yeah.
If not, it's already kind of going, is that
it's going on right now. We're recording.
You start beginning to feel like it's a zero-sum game in terms of time. Mm-hmm. Right? That every bit of time you spend on one thing is time you might not get to spend on something else.
Right.
And something else that matters. And so, you mentioned chubbing, which is, the term for talking a lot on the floor and raising procedural questions, et cetera, just to burn time, to make it harder to get to everything that perhaps some people want to get to things that people want to get to, or usually with some kind of specific target. Democrats have periodically used this, as have kind of dissidents within the Republican Party, to simply, reduce the volume of work that the majority can do. Mm-hmm. And, we're already beginning to see that some, but I think there's just enough going on that a broad enough group of people want, that is kind of the theme of, the piece that you were referencing earlier that we're working on, that should be out later. By the time you hear this podcast, it'll be out, barring disaster of some sort, small scale disaster of some sort.
Say,
and so I think that, that is a real factor here, and that, that's going to cut a couple of different ways, as you say. So it's going to be a very, interesting few days as we watch, the House move towards this big deadline on Thursday. And for those of you that are interested in these deadlines, you can find the calendars that have all these deadlines at the Texas Legislative Library and also on the TLO site. Actually, what we'll do is when we post the podcast, we'll throw that last couple of, the calendar of the last month deadlines on that post so that you can just grab it there if you can't find the others. Okay, so with the time we got left, let's move it at least briefly, and it's probably a little less complicated and immediate in some ways, at least maybe. Let's talk a little bit about the border and border security. So, as I said at the outset, we're about to see the expiration COVID
Title 42.
Yeah, the COVID arrangements under Title 42 that it's worth highlighting, that enabled both the Trump and the Biden administrations to turn people back at the border with,
basically with asylum claims.
At best, yes, with at best streamlined administrative, procedures. That is going to end this week. In advance of that, Governor Abbott yesterday announced the deployment of the new Texas Tactical Border Force to the Texas-Mexico border, closely paraphrasing from the governor's press release,
that's right,
in order to respond to the ending of Title 42. And this is just more resources to the border. At the same time, President Biden has ordered a U.S. military contingent to go down to the border. Careful to say that they would not be participating in direct interdiction, but were there to provide support. This is, obviously being seen as too little too late by Governor Abbott and Republicans more generally. But, the border and border security has also, sort of been an element, is an element of what's going on at the legislature. But it's a testament, I would argue, it's a testament to the durability and the centrality of immigration and border security to Republican attitudes in the state, Republican politics. And, we're a broken record on this. But it's one of the few major policy areas right now where the GOP majority hasn't been struggling to find some kind of consensus. And we've said it on the podcast before, bears repeating, there was an increase in funding for border security after the significant, I would say historic increases in border security spending over the last few years. There were increases in both budgets, no disagreement. Everybody's pretty happy, at least in the Republican majority, with this. And our data repeatedly show why, right?
Yeah, I mean, about 60% of Republicans routinely say that immigration or border security is the number one issue facing the state. The only, sort of punctuation or sort of deviation from that, I should say, happened at the very early onset of COVID. We've asked 2 times during this legislative session in an open-ended question what the legislature should focus on, and the plurality, near majority of Republicans offered up deal with immigration or the border. And, to your point, even throughout this entire period of increase, not even marginal increase in spending, but significant increases in border security spending and really attention and effort, the share of Republicans who say the state is spending too little on border security, if anything, is inching upward. And the reality is the end of Title 42, despite, again, codifying in the budget this huge amount of money that's been put towards the border sort of through other means kind of in the interim, it's likely to be met, in some ways with a attaboy, but what next?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's sort of the interest. I mean, we've talked a little bit about how, the centrality of immigration and border security in some ways, really gives Republicans something that Democrats, could really only hope for, which is to say, okay, if we just do this one thing in some way, shape, or form. And the truth is, this one thing that's in many ways utterly intractable, but as long as we make efforts on this one area, then, we can go back to our voters and say, see what we did this. And, for most Republican voters, they say, good, great.
Yeah.
And then they can go on and say, well, what about, this, that, and the other? But this is the main thing that really needs to be addressed. I mean,
and the fallback on what you might, within the universe of Republican attitudes, the one possible objection is like, this is just, too much money. Now, look, obviously, we've not seen any evidence of that.
No.
But to the extent that we do see it, we've seen the opposite. The fallback is a pretty easy one right now in terms of saying, well, what can I tell you? I'm with you, sister. But, as long as Joe Biden's in the White House.
Right. As long as the federal government is failing its responsibilities, then so be it. Right.
We've got to spend more to combat the open border policy of, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the politics of the moment of this
the politics of the moment are very interesting.
Are kind of interesting. So, I mean, to use the kind of horrible, cable news metaphor, but it's useful here. The split screen yesterday between what was going on in the House and in the legislature writ large and what Governor Abbott was doing was pretty remarkable. So, in the last, the split screen is on one hand, you're seeing the House voting out these gun bills in a very, moving a gun bill in a very dramatic kind of development. The legislature generally still kind of locked up over the big issues, some of which are very important to the governor, and the governor's, invested a lot of political capital. Good example of that would be ESA/vouchers, which, still seems to be, at an impasse in terms of what's going on in the House. And it's an open question whether what the governor has been doing for the last couple of months in terms of, putting pressure on House members, frankly, to vote for vouchers. I don't want to overstate this, but one would be forgiven. Let's put it this way. One might be forgiven for thinking that the timing of the coming of the end of Title 42 and a expected surge at the border kind of comes at a good time for Governor Abbott.
No, I was going to say it's an excellent. It's it's a gift in a lot of ways because, just to flesh out a little bit more what you're talking about here. I mean, right now, legislature is locked up over how they're going to move forward with a property tax reduction that they have promised repeatedly throughout the 2022 campaigns and into the session. To the voucher bill. I mean, the Senate has moved and the House is really there's not even really a competing proposal right now. It's almost just locked up. There's big differences over how the state is going to improve the reliability of the electric grid. There's, similar disagreements over how, they're going to address school safety. So the fact that, a potential summer surge of migrants at the border at this point, that's going to dominate coverage, especially in right-wing media, that's going to be the primary source of information for Republican primary voters, could not come at a better time, assuming the legislature is not going to be able to be successful on all of those things.
Right.
Not going to say they're not going to be successful in any of those things or all of them, but I think it would be surprising, given where they are right now, to see a bunch of compromises all of a sudden emerge at the 11th hour.
Right. And so, it's just a very open question. we did a post and a podcast, I think, of, a few weeks ago about, what is going on in the Republican Party, the role of Republican primary voters. And to draw these two things together, I mean, the difference between what you're looking at on immigration and border security, which, as we've said a million times on the podcast, is the great Republican unifier. And even what we were looking at in the gun data a few minutes ago, I mean, there's still 25% or so, 24% if you want to be exact, of Republican voters who still say that gun laws should be less strict.
Right.
So we emphasized the movement on the other side last time, but as we talk about where some of the difficulties are and the kind of, essentially I was going to say the tyranny, maybe that's not quite right, but the preoccupation of I'll put it this way, the almost fairly understandable preoccupation of Republican incumbents with Republican primary voters, really is kind of at play in both of these, but they manifest in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Because because of the distribution of public opinion being different on these two issues. I mean, if you think about, and we've looked at this in great depth, the difference in intensity on on immigration and border security issues is not that great when you break it out by ideological intensity, intensity of party identification. You do see more variance on guns.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, the thing is, I was thinking about this yesterday when the House moved that bill, and, it's just, I was saying how difficult it is, and I was thinking in particular the idea of defending these things. And, so just imagine for a second, the House ends up bringing this bill to the floor. Let's say they cobble together all the Democrats and enough Republicans to pass, this bill that raises the age. Let's say for some inexplicable reason, the Senate decides they're going to pass it and make Abbott deal with it and veto it because he signaled he's going to veto it. Let's say he doesn't veto it for some reason. Now the state gets sued, right. By a Second Amendment group. So the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is now going to be put in the position of defending a state law that creates a barrier to access to guns for some people.
Right.
Like, if any of this sounds crazy to you, I mean, think about the stacking of things that would need to happen.
Right.
And the reality is none of that is reasonable. I mean, the governor's clearly signaled that he's not going to, he probably would not sign this. And
he's on the record pretty firmly as saying that he thinks that it's unconstitutional.
Now, you can set aside, the hypocrisy of that statement around other sets of laws and whether that seems to matter at all, blah, blah, blah. But he's made very clear where he stands on it. The lieutenant governor's made very clear, I think, where he stands on the idea of gun laws and what direction they should go in. And again, there's no elected official in the state who's going to even come close to defending one of these laws should it get to that point. And so,
right. I mean, as we were talking before the podcast, one can come up with, several very path-dependent scenarios of what might happen here. It does still seem like the most likely outcome is that this bill does not get out of the House. But in, the broad scope of things, as we've said many times in this, it's easy to be myopic. And look, in some senses, being myopic is what you need to do. You need to see what's right in front of you at certain points. In the longer term, it probably will be significant if this bill doesn't pass, which is the most likely outcome. But it will be significant that it got out of committee this time in future sessions, I suspect.
I think maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical. I mean, I'm
not saying that it guarantees that it's going to,
No. I mean, I'm not even saying that that's not true. I guess, I mean, to me, I think the best sort of, rationale for why that bill moved at all was just totally the immediacy of it. I mean, if you kind of look around, you look at the succession of shootings, the succession of mass shootings in Texas in short order.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I usually think that this sort of stuff is overplayed, but I don't think it is here. I mean, I think the persistence of the Uvalde family is just being there and being relentless about this. It's just something, it's hard for legislators to say, I'm just going to ignore you, because you can't. Yeah. It's totally.
I also want to give a little credit to Representative Tracy King, who's been very, very persistent and very smart in the way that he wrote this bill. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I guess I would say also that,
One thing that I was just to say, I think the accumulation of, again, what happened in Allen this weekend and that legislative deadline hitting when it hit, that created the momentum to do something. And again, I don't, look, I'm not, this might sound cynical. I think this is just part of, I think the game of politics that gets played. But it really, if you look at it, you really changed the news cycle, if only for a single cycle or two, right?
Well, I think, what I was going to add to that, and you kind of got to it, but, it's the combination of, the information environments and, all of that you're talking about, as you say. We're always talking about does something happen? Do people respond? The timing of the El Paso shooting, the timing of these shootings is often not right in the middle of a session or during a session. The fact that this happened not only during a session, with these mobilized groups, and in particular the Uvalde families, sort of on site.
Who already there, ready to,
And the fact that, frankly, the members that are voting for this, particularly the Republican members on that committee, not to take anything away from them per se, but the calculation has to be there that you can vote this out of committee, say that, you were willing to give it a hearing. This goes for the leadership as well, but also rely on the fact that the clock and the calendar are both on your side in terms of where the session are, if what you want is to have it both ways a little bit. Not to put too sharp a point on it, but I think with that, thanks for being here, Josh. As always, help prepping for this. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. And our team consists of Will today, period. So thank you, Will. We'll post this podcast if you're hearing this on one of the podcast platforms. I referenced earlier that we'll have a post at our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu that'll also have graphics and links to data that we've talked about, and we've talked about a lot of things today, as well as to that calendar I mentioned. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.